Hello. This lecture is the response lecture to week 3 of the course, which is the material on Frederick Douglass and David Walker's appeal. So you guys read those works this week. I presented in the first lecture. This is the follow-up. So to start with David Walker, to begin with, whenever I introduce students to David Walker, I always get students who are both kind of stunned and inspired by the kind of language they see that comes from David Walker's appeal. David Walker was able to speak in a kind of directness and forthright nature that didn't really appear in a lot of other African-American writings from the time. David Walker was controversial. He challenged people. He challenged people who were well respected in the community to try and look at the underlying faults in the slave system. There were, of course, others who were writing at this time and who were giving speeches and so forth, and also very active in the abolitionist movement, speaking out against slavery. African Americans like George Moses Horton, Mariah Stewart, and Henry Highland Garnett. All three of them and others were very active in keeping the abolitionist movement moving forward, speaking for African American communities, and describing the kind of issues and concerns they had as they strived to bring an end to the slave system. David Walker, I think, is a very unique person in this, and I want to sort of speak to the notion that the reason why he's able to speak as he does is because of the audience that he's focused on. So we've been paying attention to how audience affects writers like Phyllis Wheatley. We talked about how she was how her writing was somewhat modified because she couldn't say certain things to her audience, but she was writing to a primarily white audience who doesn't necessarily even believe that she's a human being. Well, David Walker is writing to a very different audience. He's writing to African Americans like himself, and he's writing to African Americans who know the horrors of slavery, and he's trying to inspire, to get them to move forward, to step up, to challenge directly the notion of slavery. So David Walker is speaking to an audience of people like him, and that allows him different kinds of rhetorical strategies and uses that he can make. He doesn't have to make the kind of compromises that someone like Phyllis Wheatley does. He can speak more directly and more plainly. I mentioned in my other lecture that he's writing in what seems to be the form of the Jeremiad. A Jeremiad is a traditional kind of sermon that ministers have gotten, and it's based on the figure Jeremiah from the Old Testament. And in the Jeremiad, I should say, what happens is that the individual spends a long time describing the problems and the woes and the laments of a particular community, and then he follows that long list of problems with a prophecy. Usually it's a prophecy of some kind of doom or horror that's going to come to the group that's putting that pressure on them. So David Walker is definitely influenced by that traditional Jeremiad format for the sermon, and his writing kind of reaches that kind of a same kind of a fever pitch of intensity as he's writing to African American audiences. I think it's also interesting to think about David Walker that he's able to write freely because of who his audience is, but the kind of emotional intensity that he writes to is always one of stridency and sort of imminent pressure for revolution. But I think it's also important to note that in the North, there were other issues that African Americans were concerned about as well. And I think that I had you guys look at segments from Freedom's Journal, which is the first African American newspaper of the time. And even though the political issue of slavery remains the dominant issue that African Americans faced, if you browse through the pages of Freedom's Journal, you can see other issues and concerns that black people had as well. Some of them less dramatic, some of them lighter. So, for example, Francis Foster, who is a contemporary African-American scholar who I mentioned in my previous lecture, who provides a lot of the details about sales figures for slave narratives and so forth. Francis Foster has also done a more contemporary work where she just looks at Freedom's Journal, for example, for stories about love and advice to the lovelorn. So those kinds of stories were there for black audiences too in the 19th century. It wasn't just the political imperative of abolishing slavery. There were also the other kinds of human concerns about love, about family. Those kinds of issues were there, and the black newspapers were the places where those kinds of particular African-American experiences could find voice. So I think all that is very important and interesting in the first section of stuff that I talked about, which was African-American experience in the North. I want to turn now to talk some more about African-American experience in the South, which was very different than that in the North. One thing which I asked you guys to do on your discussion questions was to look up some of the things about slave revolutions and rebellions. As I was looking through your responses, I noticed a lot of people, maybe not a lot, but I saw some statements from people about questions about how black people managed to live under slavery. Why didn't people resist slavery? Contemporary folks who would resist slavery. And I wanted to point out the fact that there were African Americans who did resist slavery in different ways. So I asked you guys to look up some of the slave rebellions that occurred in the United States. In the U.S., there were at least 3 major slave rebellions that are commonly noted. Those are rebellions led by Nat Turner, Gabriel Prosser, and Denmark Vesey. Each one of these rebellions, although all of them were ultimately unsuccessful in that they did not lead to long-standing black communities being able to exist outside of the slave system that surrounded them, all of them ultimately ended in the death of the person or persons who were leading them. Nevertheless, they all involved good numbers of black people who took strident steps against the white master class. And so they all show that there were black Americans who were in active resistance to the slave system. This would become present also in other kinds of situations like John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, which would occur in the 1850s. You had African Americans who took part in that military action as well, trying to bring slavery to a close. In addition to these kind of overt rebellions that those 3 people I mentioned sort of spearheaded, there are other kinds of resistance as well. There were good numbers of African Americans who ran away, who left the South for the North. There were other means of resistance as well. There are things like work slowdowns and work stoppages. There are a lot of different methods that different African Americans had to make their situation in slavery at the very least bearable. So I think it's important to look at those kind of circumstances and to consider also what kind of things would have kept a person living under the slave system as opposed to rebelling, as opposed to running to the North. And you should consider that people born into the slave system were there with their families. So they were there with, the only place they had ever known was the plantation. The only family they had ever known were the slaves on that plantation with them. And to run away from the plantation was to leave what little security there was for the absolute unknown. The slaves were not given any kind of knowledge about surrounding territories. You didn't know that, there were swamps to the left of you and mountains to the right of you or anything of that sort. You had no maps which one could turn to escape. Slaves weren't told how one would live on the streets of the North. If you escaped the South and managed to make it to one of the free territories, you would know no one there. How would you survive? Slaves weren't given information about the Underground Railroad. That kind of information was secret. And people, for the most part, if you tried to escape, you were escaping into a world of being entirely on your own in an environment which was lethal to you. How would you survive the winters without some place to stay warm if you were able to escape from your master? So there are a lot of different reasons that determined how individuals lived through the experience of slavery, whether they lived as outright rebels or whether they lived as more covert people trying to eke out some sort of existence under that system. I think that the narrative you guys read, Frederick Douglass's 1845 narrative, points out some of those different methods that different Africans had for living under the world of slavery. Frederick Douglass is a very important figure for a number of different reasons. In addition to his narrative, he was an outspoken person against the system of slavery. After the Civil War, he continued a public life speaking for African American rights under the Constitution. He was an advocate for women's rights as well. Frederick Douglass was just very much on the right side of history in terms of the causes that he promoted and supported. In his narrative, which is often seen as the pinnacle of slave narrative writing and which is celebrated by many, there are a lot of very interesting things that I was trying to draw your attention to. I asked you guys, for example, to talk about the seafaring imagery that occurs throughout Frederick Douglass' narrative. And in that seafaring imagery, you guys frequently directed your attention to the portion of where he's sitting on the Chesapeake Bay looking at the ships. And he sees the ships out in the ocean, and he says, "You ships, you're free, whereas I stand here being a slave." And one of the continuing motifs that runs throughout Douglass's narrative is the connection of ships to the notion of freedom. Ships are those things that are free. And ultimately, Douglas wants to achieve that kind of freedom. So if you look through the text and see different things that are associated with images of ships, they are very commonly associated with some kinds of notions of freedom as well. One of the interesting parts of this is, for example, when Douglas learns about the term abolition. He learns it from sailors. So he's down at the docks, and the sailors are there, and there are sailors from another country, and they ask Douglas if he's a slave for life, and he has to say that he is. And they explain to him, well, this is what abolition is. And suddenly Douglas has this idea that he can possibly become free. So there at the ships, he learns about this notion of freedom. I think it's also interesting that Douglas makes other connections between these images of the ships, so that they're not just tied to the notion of freedom, but through them they link other things. And in particular, I'm talking about how Douglas links the notion of literacy to the idea of freedom. So Douglas learns to read from the ships as well. So he first learns some of his letters, the L and the R, for example, from planks on the ship. So that makes a strong connection there between the notion of the ships, which Douglas explicitly connects to the notion of freedom, but which I think he's also connecting to a notion of the power of the word, knowing how to read, knowing how to write. You'll recall I talked about Aloud Equiano in a previous lecture and his image of the talking book, and how Afro-American writers, I argued, of this time in particular, were very interested in achieving mastery of the word. And so Equiano establishes that trend. I think that in the narrative of Frederick Douglass, he continues that trend as well. I think that the notion of literacy and the seafaring images in Douglas are very important. I think there are others that occur as well that are worth discussing. I asked you guys to, one of the questions was about how Douglas represents the communities in the North. And I think those are very interesting in that when he escapes to the North, he finds a black community that is protective and that is warm and that is welcoming. And I think it's best characterized by that moment where he's at a meeting where they're talking about things, and they mention that someone has been trying to capture escaped slaves and send them back to the world of slavery. And they found the person who's been doing it, and he said we should, as a community, should eliminate this person right now. So I think Douglas shows that there is a sense of community that grows in the North. And an interesting question, I thought, one which I haven't got a fully developed answer to, but which I think is worthy of bringing up, is, we talked about that notion of within the circle that Douglas brings up in his description of his life in the South. He says when he hears the songs of the slaves that at the time he sang the songs, he was within the circle, but he didn't adequately understand the songs. He was, again, too much within the circle. Now that Douglas is outside of the circle, he's the contemporary writer outside of the circle, he understands the song, but he can't participate in the same way as he could before. And I think that term within the circle speaks to an idea of this community in the South, of the slave South, the slave community that Douglas was a part of, and then that Douglas was removed from. And I wonder if that kind of folk community that Douglas seems to say he has no more connection to, is that kind of community being replaced in the North. So when he's in the North, in this group of escaped slaves and free blacks who are living in New York and Massachusetts and binding themselves together, holding on and protecting one another, is he again now within the circle? And if he is within the circle, what are the characteristics of that circle and community? Can he understand them and articulate their concerns in the way that he could or actually could not when he was part of the slave community? So again, I don't know if that connection, if I fully articulated a very clear statement of what I mean by this connection, but it seems to me that Douglas is working with two distinct communities. He has said that he was within the circle, and while he was in the circle, however, he was limited in terms of how he did understand it, but now he has an understanding of it. When he's moved to the North, can he have that same understanding for a group that he is now within? I think that just kind of gives us some insights or raises some questions about how Douglas portrays things in the end. Again, not necessarily the clearest question I've ever raised, but one which I think is interesting. Douglas has a bunch of other things which are also worth discussing, and which I feel that in this format I'm kind of giving short shrift to. I think that I raised questions about how Douglas talks about Christianity and his appendix, and why he bothers to include that in there. And many of you state, I think correctly, that the reason why he includes the appendix is because, like Wheatley, he's writing to this mostly white audience, and he's got to convince them about the horrors of slavery without offending them. So he's got to kind of show them that there is hypocrisy in religion in the South, but he just believes it's that group in the South that's hypocritical, not all Christians, because he's dependent upon all Christians for his argument against slavery. So I think Douglas does that kind of work because of his white audience, and therefore it sort of necessitates him including that appendix. I think that Douglas has other ways of addressing Christianity. There is one scene that happens fairly early on where he's describing the garden that his master has. And the way he describes this garden is done very much so using the language of the story of the Garden of Eden. And it becomes a very interesting kind of parallel Douglas makes there. But in that parallel he makes to the Garden of Eden, where the slave is trying to pick the apple in this instance, the figure who's put in the role of God is the master class. And Douglas does that in order to show the corruption again that occurs throughout the South, that the slave system places humankind into the world of, or into the realm of God effectively, and the master has godlike power over the slave. And Douglas is hoping by using these kinds of images and metaphors to convince his audience of the wrongness of these kind of situations. So there's all kind of stuff about Douglas that's worth talking about, and unfortunately I don't think I can do so any further in this particular lecture, but I think that we should raise more questions on the discussion board, and I think that's about it for this response. Thanks.